Okay, so you want to dive deep into the source material and pull out the juicy bits, right? That's what we're all about. And today, well, today we're looking into a story that, let's be honest, is both disturbing and kind of a puzzle. The Manson family. We've got the Wikipedia pages here, the ones of the Manson family itself, the Tate LaBianca murders. Oh, and a piece from People magazine, reflecting on it all 55 years later. So our mission, if you will, is to go past all the hype, the sensationalism, and try to get to the core of this dark, dark chapter in American history.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. We're going to look at how this group even came together in the first place, what beliefs they held, however twisted they might seem, and then obviously those terrible crimes they committed. And lastly, we'll touch on the impact, how it all reverberates even now. For you listeners, it's about really understanding this quickly, seeing it from different angles, and hopefully getting a feel for what was really going on, all without getting too bogged down in all the grim details.
Right, let's unpack this whole thing. For anyone out there who's like, okay, I need the basics, the Manson family was this crazy mix, right? Like part commune, part gang, part full-on cult, and all of it led by this guy, Charles Manson. Late 60s, early 70s, California, that was their scene. And at one point, they had like 100 people who considered themselves part of this so-called family.
Yeah?
Wild, right?
And let's not forget what's at the center of it all. Pure tragedy. This group is responsible for at least 9 murders. Some folks think it could be way more than that, maybe even twice as many. But yeah, those Tate LaBianca murders, August of '69, that's what really sticks with people. I mean, still shocks you to think about it.
It does. So how did all this even begin? Like, what came together to create this whole phenomenon? Where do we even start?
It all starts with the man himself, right?
Yeah.
Charles Manson, born in '34, spent huge chunks of his life in institutions. And March of '67, he's released from prison. That's a turning point, for sure. That's when the path to this family really starts to take shape.
So he gets out of prison and lands right in San Francisco. That's the middle of all that cultural change.
Yeah.
What happens when he gets there?
Well, first off, he goes to Berkeley, helped out by someone he knew from prison. A funny thing is, in prison, he learned how to play the steel guitar from this bank robber, Alvin Karpis, of all people. But in San Francisco, he's basically living by begging, right? Then he meets this woman, Mary Brunner, a library assistant. He moves in with her and gets this pretty quickly. Their place is packed with like 18 other women.
Whoa, 18 women. That's a lot of people, and really fast. What does that tell us about Manson, about his pull early on?
It's not just the number, it's how quickly it happened. Like almost no pushback.
Right.
That says something, right? It seems like he could spot people's weaknesses, what they felt was missing, and then he offered it to them. Belonging, attention, maybe even just a feeling of rebelling against, well, everything. Mary Brunner. She wasn't keen on having all these people in her apartment, but he somehow got her to go along with it.
And then he starts to become this guru figure, right? Like a spiritual leader or something.
That's exactly it. So this is during the Summer of Love, Haight-Ashbury, 1967. Everyone's looking for like new ways to live, new ways to think. And there's even this idea that he might have taken some stuff from the Process Church of the Final Judgment. Now, they were pretty out there, even for that time. They believed in like bringing together opposite forces, Christ and Satan. It's not clear how much they influenced him directly, but it shows you the kind of weird, unconventional stuff that was swirling around, stuff that Manson could have grabbed onto and twisted for his own purposes.
Yeah, I mean, reincarnated Christians fighting the Romans, the establishment, all that. It's a pretty dramatic story to tell.
Yeah.
How did that kind of thinking gain traction?
Right. It is dramatic, and it shows what kind of world Manson was building. Oh, and around this time, he starts going by Charles Willis Manson, like reinventing himself completely. Anyway, by the end of that summer, he and some of the women are cruising around in this old school bus they fixed up, and they eventually end up in and around Los Angeles.
And they're growing in other ways too, right?
Oh, yeah. So April '68 in Topanga Canyon, Mary Brunner gives birth to Manson's son, Valentine Michael. Other family members were there, helping with the birth. And Brunner, like a lot of them, used different names, aliases.
It sounds like he was really good at making this little world where he was the center of it all.
You got it. There are these stories, little glimpses into how he acted, how manipulative he was. Al Lewis, the actor, remembers Manson babysitting his kids. He seemed like a nice guy back then. There's also this music producer, Phil Kaufman, who introduced Manson to a film producer. They were thinking about a Black Jesus movie, a modern take. And Manson, apparently, he gave him some pretty good ideas. There was even this thing where he kissed a follower's feet and then she kissed his. Like, he wanted to look all egalitarian, but it was all a show.
But behind that whole, nice guy, equal to everyone act, There was something much darker going on, right?
Oh, absolutely. Gary Stromberg, that film producer, he saw right through it. He said Manson was a master at seeing people's weaknesses, their emotional needs, and then using them. He even tried to manipulate one of the Straight Satan's motorcycle guys by offering him the women in the family. And Stromberg saw another thing. Manson preaching against material possessions one day. Then someone points out his fancy bus, all decked out. What does Manson do? Tosses the keys away like it's nothing. All an act, all about controlling the narrative.
And that ability to draw people in, to control them,
Yeah.
it really comes out when he gets involved in the music world, right? Especially with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big connection.
No doubt. So, spring of '68, Dennis Wilson is driving around, picks up Patricia Klinwinkle and Ella Jo Bailey hitchhiking. Reports say he was probably high at the time. He takes them back to his place, and next morning, guess who shows up? Manson.
Wait, so how they met, that's not totally clear, is it?
Yeah, there are different versions. Manson said they bumped into each other at a friend's house in San Francisco. Manson was looking for weed, and Wilson gave him his LA address. Wilson, on the other hand, said he was talking about the Maharishi, the Beatles guru, to some women he'd picked up, and they mentioned their own guru, a guy named Charlie.
So however it happened, they get connected.
Yeah.
And pretty much the family just moves in with Wilson.
Pretty much. And their numbers just explode, double in a few months. Wilson ends up paying for a ton of their stuff. We're talking $100,000 medical bills because some of the women caught gonorrhea, a bunch of cash for a car they borrowed, and completely trashed.
Wow, that's some serious money. Why was Wilson so fascinated by Manson and the family?
It seems like he was captivated by Manson, the personality, the music. They'd sing together, talk a lot. And there are stories that both of them, they saw the women in the group as, well, less than equal. Wilson even paid for studio time for Manson to record, introduced him to big names in the music industry. People like Terry Melcher, he later lived at that Cielo Drive house, and Rudy Altobelli, who owned the place.
And that connection with Melcher, that was a big opportunity for Manson, even if it didn't pan out in the end.
Absolutely. There was another guy, Greg Jacobson, also in the music business. He was impressed by Manson, too, even gave him some money to record. But things went sour. Wilson got tired of the whole scene, the financial drain, and moved out. And that's what led to the whole family being evicted.
So after that whole music scene thing, where do they end up?
August '68, Manson sets up shop at Spawn Ranch. This was an old movie set for Westerns, pretty rundown. The family made a little money giving horseback rides to tourists, but their free rent basically came from the women. They did chores, and, well, on Manson's orders, they slept with the owner, George Spahn. He was nearly blind. Lynette Frum, Squeaky Frum got her nickname, because Spahn was always pinching her thigh. It was creepy. And around that time, Charles Tex Watson joins the group.
Okay, so Spawn Ranch is where this whole helter-skelter thing really takes shape, right? What exactly was helter-skelter in Manson's mind?
So picture this. Manson listening to the Beatles' White Album, but he's hearing it all wrong, all twisted. He becomes convinced that those songs are like predicting a race war, black people against white people, and it's going to be the end of the world as we know it.
The Beatles as, like, doomsday prophets. That's a unique interpretation, to say the least. How come his followers bought into it?
Well, yeah, it's out there, right? But think about it. Helter Skelter, it gave them a story, a purpose, however messed up. Their petty crimes, their chaotic lives, it all became part of some big cosmic battle. They were the chosen ones, the survivors. That kind of thinking, feeling special, that's textbook cult stuff. And there was a lot of real anxiety back then, social unrest, racial tension. Manson just tapped into that and offered up this, well, completely made-up explanation.
So this weird belief system becomes the justification for all the horrible stuff that comes next. Let's talk about that, about the violence, the murders. The sources lay it all out, starting with that incident at 150 CL Drive in March '69.
Right. March '69, Manson shows up at that house on Cielo Drive. It was Terry Melcher's place before, but no one invited Manson there. Anyway, he runs into this photographer, Shiroka Tommy, who's there to take pictures of Sharon Tate. Manson's looking for someone, but Hatami doesn't recognize the name, tells him to try the guest house, and for a second, Sharon Tate herself appears. Later that night, Manson's back, this time talking to Rudy Altobelli, the owner. He asks about Melcher, but Altobelli says he's moved to Malibu.
In that brief meeting, it stuck with people, didn't it?
Yeah, it's eerie, right? The next day, on the flight to Rome, Tate mentions that creepy-looking guy who came to the house to Altobelli. It foreshadows what's going to happen there.
Okay, then a few months later, July '69, there's the shooting of Bernard Crowe. What was that all about?
So Tex Watson, he's gotten into drug dealing and robbed this guy Crow, who was also a dealer. Crow threatens to come after everyone at Spawn Ranch, revenge. Manson goes to Crow's apartment in Hollywood and shoots him. Crow survives, but Manson thought he'd killed him.
And that seems to have really amped up his paranoia, his feeling of being threatened.
Totally. Manson thought Crow was a Black Panther, so he starts freaking out about the Panthers coming after them. Spawn Ranch basically turns into a fortress, armed guards, the whole 9 yards. He even tries to recruit the Straight Satan's motorcycle gang for protection.
And then it gets worse, right? The end of July '69, Gary Hinman is murdered. This seems like a big step towards those Tate LaBianca killings.
It was. Manson sends Bobby Beausoleil, Mary Brunner, and Susan Atkins to Hinman's place. Manson thinks Hinman's got this inheritance, wants them to get the money. They hold him hostage for 2 days, but Hinman keeps saying he doesn't have the cash. Then Manson shows up, cuts Hinman with a sword, and Beausoleil stabs him to death, apparently on Manson's orders.
And they left a message at the scene, written in Hinman's blood. Pretty gruesome.
Yeah, political piggy and a symbol that looked like a panther paw, all written in blood. It's messed up. As for why they killed Hinman, there's some debate. Some say it was a bad drug deal, mescaline sold to the Straight Satans that went south. But others, including Atkins, said Manson believed Hinman had this $21,000 inheritance coming his way. Whatever the reason, they got Beausoleil later, driving Hinman's car.
Okay, that brings us to those 2 nights in August '69, August 8th and 9th, the Tate LaBianca murders. Let's start with what happened at 150 Cielo Drive, the Tate residence.
All right, night of August 8th, Manson tells Tex Watson to take Susan Atkins, Linda Kasabian, and Patricia Krenwinkel to Cielo Drive. The order is clear. Kill everyone in the house. Sharon Tate was there. She was 8.5 months pregnant. Her friends, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, they were there too. And Stephen Parent, he was visiting the caretaker. Roman Polanski, Sharon Tate's husband, was out of the country.
Man, the brutality of these murders is just, it's hard to grasp.
I know, right? Each victim was stabbed multiple times. Stephen Parent, he was shot in his car outside. Inside, Sebring was shot and stabbed. Frykowski stabbed over and over, shot too. Folger, they chased her outside and stabbed her. Tate, she begged for her life, for her baby's life, but they stabbed her too, multiple times. And as they're leaving, Atkins uses Tate's blood to write "pig" on the front door. Linda Kasabian, she was there, but she didn't participate in the killings.
And the horror didn't stop there. The next night, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca are murdered too.
Yep. Manson, Watson, Krenwinkel, Van Houten, and Grogan, they all go to the LaBianca's house. Manson and Watson go in first, tie up the couple. Then Manson leaves, sends Krenwinkel and Van Houten in. Watson stabs Leno LaBianca a bunch of times, and Krenwinkel and Van Houten stab Rosemary too.
Again, they leave those messages written in blood.
Yeah, on the walls, the fridge, all over. Rise, death to pigs, and helter skelter, spelled wrong, and they leave a carving fork and a knife sticking out of Leno LaBianca's body. Manson had actually planned another murder that night at Saladin Nader's house, but Kasabian stopped it from happening.
And there were other victims too, right? Not just those high-profile cases.
Yeah.
There was Donald Shorty Shea.
Right. Around August 16th, they killed Shorty Shea. He was a stuntman at Spawn Ranch. Manson thought he'd ratted them out to the cops during a raid and was pissed about Shea's marriage to a Black woman. Manson, Bruce Davis, and Steve Clem Grogan were all convicted for Shea's murder. Later on, Grogan helped the authorities find Shea's body and got parole.
So we've got these confirmed murders, but the sources also list all these other people who might be connected to the family, people whose deaths are still suspicious. It's important to remember that a lot of these are unsolved cases, but the sheer number of them, it really shows how much fear and violence there was around the Manson family.
Yeah, the LAPD thought there could be at least 12 more victims. The Wikipedia page, it names a bunch of people. Nancy Warren, Clyda Delaney, Marina Elizabeth Habe, Darwin Morell Scott, he was Manson's uncle Mark Waltz. John Philip Hott ruled a suspicious suicide. James Sharp and Doreen Gall, 2 Scientologists, Reet Jurvetson, Joel Buse Arsagia-Good's husband, their own lawyer, Ronald Hughes, James Lambert Willett and his wife Lauren Chevelle Willett, and even Lawrence Merrick, who co-directed a documentary about Sharon Tate, and his sister Mikel Mignano. It's a long list, and for each one, the details, how connected they were to the family, it varies, but most of them, no one was ever convicted. It leaves this really unsettling feeling like there's so much we still don't know.
It's really scary to think about how much more violence there might have been. Okay, so we all know about Helter Skelter, right? But the sources also suggest other possible motives for the Tate LaBianca murders. What else could have been going on?
Well, one idea is that the murders were meant to be copycats, to help out Bobby Beausoleil. Remember, he was in jail for the Hinman murder. So the thinking goes, if you create similar murders, the cops might think the real killer is still out there. Some family members said this was the plan, and some investigators believed it too.
That's chilling, thinking about it that way.
That's
Like,
true, bro.
it adds this whole other level of planning and coldness to it all.
For sure. Another motive that comes up is drugs. There are theories that Jay Sebring, Wojciech Frykowski, Charles Watson, and even Manson, they were all involved in... Right. The thinking is that they targeted that house because of Terry Melcher, the music producer. He'd rejected Manson's music, wouldn't help him make a documentary. Manson probably knew Melcher had moved, but Susan Atkins said they wanted to scare him. But there's another wrinkle. Some researchers say Melcher might have been closer to some family members than he let on, which muddies the whole revenge idea as the only explanation.
It's like a tangled mess.
Right.
Hard to say for sure what the real reason was for such horrific acts. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about the investigation, how they caught these guys, and the trial. That whole thing was wild, a real spectacle.
Yeah, so at first, the Tate and LaBianca murders, they were investigated separately. With Tate, they thought it was drug-related. They saw some similarities to the Hinman case, but didn't really connect the dots right away. Then they find the LaBianca crime scene, those messages written in blood, and that's when they start thinking maybe it's connected to the Beatles, that White Album.
And the big break in the case, it came from, like, a bunch of different things coming together, right? Pure luck almost.
Exactly. So the detectives working on the LaBianca case, they talk to the Hinman investigators, and they learn about Bobby Beausoleil's girlfriend, Kitty Lutzinger. Turns out she'd been arrested along with some other family members for stealing cars out in the desert, where they'd gone after leaving Spawn Ranch. Funny thing is, they got caught for stealing dune buggies. Those cops had no idea they'd stumbled onto people involved in those big LA murders.
It's crazy, right? They get caught for something so small compared to the murders.
I know. But the LaBianca detectives, they follow up on everything. They talk to a motorcycle gang that Manson tried to recruit, and they hint at a connection between Manson and those Tate LaBianca killings. At the same time, someone who is in jail with Susan Atkins tells the LAPD that Atkins confessed the family's involvement. So they arrest Atkins for the Hinman murder, and then in jail, she spills everything to other inmates.
So these random events, plus that confession, it all starts to come together for the cops.
Right. They issue warrants for Watson, Krenwinkel, and Kasabian. Watson and Krenwinkel are found in Texas and Alabama. Kasabian turns herself in New Hampshire. And then they find more evidence. Watson's gun, found by a kid, bloody clothes, and Atkins' knife, right there at the Tate house.
And then the trial starts. The People v. Charles Manson et al. June 1970. It was huge news, super chaotic, really strange. And Linda Kasabian, she's the prosecution's star witness, gets immunity for testifying.
Yeah, that trial was bonkers right from the start. Manson's allowed to represent himself at first, but then they take that away because he's so disruptive. They even have to replace the judge. And Manson and the women, they start carving X's into their foreheads. Later on, it becomes a swastika, like they're rejecting society or something.
So the prosecution, they're pushing the whole helter-skelter motive, right?
Yeah.
But the defense says those messages written in blood, they're just copying the Hinman scene. And there's even a problem with where they found a wallet. They thought it was planted to frame black people, but it wasn't.
Yeah, at first they thought the wallet, taken from one of the murders, was planted in a black neighborhood to make it look like black people did it. But it turns out it was found in a mostly white neighborhood. So that messed up their theory.
And the whole trial was just crazy. Family members outside the courthouse threatening witnesses like Paul Watkins and Juan Flynn. They even tried to shut up Barbara Hoyt by giving her LSD in Hawaii so she wouldn't testify. And Manson, he's pulling stunts in the courtroom. He even flashes this newspaper headline to the jury, the one that says he's guilty.
It was like a circus. And the defendants, they're all doing stuff together, synchronized statements, being all creepy and unified. Manson even tries to attack the judge, so they're always getting dragged out of the courtroom. There are even rumors that the judge started carrying a gun because he was so scared.
But then the defense does something unexpected. They rest their case without calling any witnesses.
Yeah, it was strange. Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten, they wanted to testify, say that Manson didn't actually order them to do the murders. But their lawyers, they didn't let them. Manson, he does testify, but not in front of the jury. He says he didn't write the Beatles album and didn't order the murders.
And then, on top of everything else, one of the defense attorneys, Ronald Hughes, disappears.
I know, it's like something out of a movie. He goes camping during a break in the trial and just vanishes. They find his body months later, all decomposed. No one ever proved it, but people always said the family killed him, maybe because he wasn't doing what Manson wanted. It really messed up the trial. They had to delay everything, find a new lawyer for Leslie Van Houten, and then, during the prosecution's closing arguments, more disruptions. In the end, they banned the defendants from the courtroom for the rest of the guilt phase.
So after all that craziness, the jury finds them all guilty. All 4 defendants guilty on all 27 counts. That was January 71. Then they move on to the penalty phase, where the women try a whole new strategy.
Yeah, in the penalty phase, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten, they say that the murders were just copycats of the Hinman murder. And they claim Linda Kasabian planned it all, which is pretty wild. But Atkins, she couldn't really explain that political piggy message from Hinman's place. And Manson, he goes all in on being weird, shaves his head, starts calling himself the devil.
But it doesn't work. March 29th, 1971, the jury sentences all 4 of them to death. And then in April, they're officially given the death penalty.
Yeah, but in 72, the California Supreme Court, they get rid of the death penalty, so their sentences get changed to life in prison. Charles Watson, he had a separate trial, was also convicted and sentenced to death, but that got changed to life too.
In the Manson family story, it didn't end there, did it? Even after the trial in prison, it kept going.
Oh, yeah. In prison, Manson tries to get in with the Aryan Brotherhood at first, but then he kind of becomes a follower. His mother, she gave interviews later, said his childhood wasn't that bad, that he wasn't neglected. And the rest of the family, they kept making news too, like Squeaky. For Mao, she tries to assassinate President Ford in 75. Sandra Good gets convicted for sending threats. From even escapes from prison for a bit in 87.
And over the years, there have been all these parole hearings, people changing their stories, even searches for more victims.
Yeah, it never really ends, does it? Steve Clem Grogan, he got parole in 85. Catherine Scher, she admitted later that what she said during the trial about Kasabian being the mastermind was all made up, that Manson told her to say it. Bobby Beausoleil, he keeps changing his story about the Hinman murder. William Garretson, the caretaker at Cielo Drive, he later said that he actually heard the murders happening but was too scared to do anything. Susan Atkins, she died in prison in 2009 after they denied her parole a bunch of times. Barbara Hoyt, she talked about the threats she got to stop her from testifying. And in 2008, they searched Barker Ranch for bodies but didn't find anything. In 2009, Linda Kasabian gave a rare interview 40 years after the murders. Manson himself, he died in prison in 2017. Bobby Beausoleil was recommended for parole, but they denied it in 2019. And just recently, in 2023, Leslie Van Houten was finally granted parole.
It's a story that keeps going, even after all these years. But the Tate LaBianca murders, they had a huge impact on America, didn't they? Like on our culture, how we see the world.
Oh, totally. Those murders, they really shook people up. A lot of folks say that was the end of the 60s, the end of that whole peace and love thing. The murders were so random, so brutal, and then you've got that crazy helter-skelter stuff. It all just shattered that feeling of hope that people had. And the fact that the murders seemed kind of ritualistic, that fed into the whole satanic panic that freaked everyone out in the years that followed.
And then there's how it's shown up in movies, TV, books, music. The Manson family story has really seeped into pop culture.
Yeah, for sure. Vincent Bugliosi's book, Helter Skelter, that was a huge bestseller, and they made it into a TV movie a few times. More recently, there's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Mindhunter, all sorts of stuff. They even have a word for it. Manson-sploitation, like all these dark, violent films that came out after the murders, all playing on that morbid fascination people have.
So let's wrap this up. We've covered a lot. How the Manson family started. That messed up helter-skelter ideology, the horrific murders, the wild trial, and how it all continues to affect us today. Just remember, everything we talked about comes from those sources you gave us. It's a deep dive into this really dark, complicated piece of history.
And that leads us to a final thought for you listeners. We've talked about all sorts of motives, right? Helter-skelter, poppycat killings, drugs, revenge on Terry Melcher. What do you think is the most likely reason for what the Manson family did? Was it one thing or a mix of everything? And what does this all say about us, about humans, how susceptible we are to manipulation, to violence, especially when you throw in a cult-like group and a society that's going through a lot of change? It's a pretty scary combination to think about.